Audio Jungle.
Proud Mary. Umbrella Man Prologue Teaser. Inspired by a storyboard illustrated by Romario Reyes. Written by Alan Mark Ferreira. Narrated by Rick Font. Color illustration by Manu Mirafruz. Chapter 1. Little Miss Lady. As fast as she possibly could, the young girl rapidly placed one foot in front of the other. Choking sounds were all that escaped Mary Ann's lips as she gasped and coughed at the exhaust fumes, assailment of her every labored breath. Despite this, she continued sprinting forward, pushing her way through the unrelenting cloud of carbon monoxide as the objection of her aspiration inched its way even further from her grasp. She was beginning to make some steady progress until something suddenly snatched at her inner leg. The jolt of the blow threatened to catapult her face first onto the cold, hard, grater-like asphalt. Stealing a quick glance down, she realized that it was the tip of her umbrella. Not risking the chance of falling flat on her face, she immediately discarded the umbrella. Freeing up her right hand, this allowed her to absorb the impact of her inevitable fall, by now being able to scramble across the ground on all fours, quickly rectify her posture, and continue her run at a breakneck speed. The folded umbrella hit the road, sprung open, and ricocheted off into the roadside grass. Mary attempted again to call out for the driver to stop, but her congested cries were drowned out by the loud roar of the vehicle's large diesel engine. For a split second, she considered running back to retrieve her umbrella. It was the only one she had, and even though it was a hand-me-down from the daughter of one of her mother's friends, she treasured it deeply. Besides, her mother would not be able to afford a replacement and would have Mary pay for the loss of the umbrella via a long re-educational session with her belt. Her mother never faltered in reminding Mary of the value of things and her responsibility of making sure that they lasted. Mary was petrified of incurring another beating from her mother. But if she turned back to get the umbrella, she would definitely miss the bus home, and that beating would be one from which she would spend days recovering. Deciding on the lesser of two evils, Mary continued to press on. She would just have to, as terrible as it would be, settle on enduring another one of her mother's educational lessons. The thought of knowing what punishment awaited her should this transgression be discovered by her mother drove her legs to keep running long after they should have given out, and long after the taillights of the bus disappeared from view around the dark corner ahead, leaving Mary flooded in darkness. And still the young girl ran. She ran until her lungs failed her, and exhaustion's crippling touch forced her to her knees. Mary Ann was now alone, scared and alone. Placing her hands on her knees, she coughed the remaining fumes and the taste of the exhaust from her mouth. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she stood there, her skin coated in a slick sheen of sweat that was being highlighted by the neighboring streetlight. Managing to finally get a hold of her breathing, Mary stood up and tried to assess just exactly where she was, when a car suddenly whizzed past her at a breathtaking speed. The impact of the wind it created flipped up her clothes and nearly knocked her from her feet. Her whole body trembled with the force of it. Despite the miniature dust storm the passing car created, through squinted eyes she managed to get a glance at the speeding car's license plate. She noted that it began with the letter P. That meant that it was a privately owned car, and they were not supposed to be using the priority bus route as a means of commuting. Those kinds of drivers were usually the cause of most of the accidents on the bus route, many of them being fatal. She knew that she needed to be more careful. So after taking a quick moment to rearrange her dress and compose herself, as it was very important for a young lady to always be presentable despite her circumstances, she gingerly stepped off to the side of the road. She had been told before that whenever walking along a main road or highway, that she should always walk in the direction of the oncoming traffic. But the opposite side of the road was poorly lit, and she didn't want to risk having to cross the road if by chance another bus happened by. If she had any money on her, she would have stopped one of the many red bandit maxi taxis that often frequent this stretch of road. Maybe she thought she could stop one and beg them for a ride. They held about 24 people. If anything, maybe she could squeeze in and sit on the floor by the door. There was a risk to this, too. Many drivers would cuss her out for having her waste their time, but she'd rather a tongue lashing from an angry driver and a few of his passengers than a beating from her mother. She'd rather anything than that. Her spirits slightly lifted. She continued down the bus route at a brisk walk, checking over her shoulder ever so often in hope that a maxi would soon come her way. After what felt like an eternity of walking, Mary checked her watch. It was getting late, much too late. The realization of this brought on a flow of new tears. Her breath began to quicken as the possibility of her not making it home in time became more of a reality. Just then, something cold and wet fell upon her bare shoulder, followed by another one on the nape of her neck. Mary, her hopes further drenched, solemnly stared up at the sky above her. It was going to rain. She glanced back to the direction where she lost her umbrella. It was a long way back and completely out of sight. She pondered going back to retrieve it quickly, but decided against it. She could not afford the time. The beating she would receive for losing it would be far better than the one she'd receive for leaving her little brother home alone. Mary turned in the direction of her home and once again began running as fast as her weary legs could carry her. "Alia, see she anywhere?" a voice called out. "Nah, not a thing," another voice in the distance replied, with two additional ones also voicing their lack of success. The small group of children continued their search of the property's expansive grounds. Just where had Mary run off to? She had been gone for hours. Exhaustion once again clung at Mary's heels, and she slowed to a stop, lest she risk collapsing again. She felt like she'd been running for hours, but her watch told her otherwise. According to the pink and red device, she'd only been running for 10 minutes, which was strange because it felt like an eternity, and she was no stranger to running for long stretches of time, playing with her friends. What was even more peculiar was that since that car had first sped past her, she had not seen a single one drive by, neither going to or from the direction of her house. The bus route was completely empty. Thunder suddenly rumbled above her, and Mary heard the torrent of rain before she felt it splash down on her skin in waves of heavy and oddly painful droplets. Up ahead, she spotted a dimly lit footstall. It was the kind of stall people often hastily erected out of a galvanized and cheap wood at the side of the road. This was done so that farmers or traders who lived close by could walk out from their homes and use the stall to display and peddle their wares. At the best of times, they were not the most sturdy of things, but luckily for her, this one happened to have a makeshift roof. Using the last of her energy, she made for the shelter and hoped with great hope that the shelter was not also the home of a nest of Jack Spaniards. "And when was the last time you saw her?" the cop asked Johnny as he shifted his flashlight from each of Johnny's eyes. The light aggravated him fiercely, and not short order had Johnny's eyes watering. She was in the room with us," he stammered in response to the officer's question. The constant shine of the flashlight was making it difficult for him to concentrate. "And then, what did she do?" the officer continued. Well, then she... Johnny began to reply. She sat on the floor and cried her eyes out. The rain was coming down in droves, and from the sound of it, she imagined it would not be letting up any time soon. At this rate, she'd never be able to make it home in time, and even if she did, she'd be soaking wet. and that would incur an additional reprimand from her mother, a reprimand her mother would eagerly reinforce with her belt. As the thundering drone of heavy rain splashed down onto the thin metal roof, Mary wondered just how such a simple venture could have gone so wrong. She remembered getting the call from Cynthia earlier that afternoon. Her classmate had just gotten a copy of Savannah Green, a real estate board game similar to that of Monopoly, where players compete to see who can purchase and develop all the properties surrounding the Queen's Park Savannah. She, along with her classmates, had known about the game's development for a while, and they had been waiting patiently for it to be released. As far as she knew, it was not supposed to be out for another couple of months. But it was no surprise that someone like Cynthia got a hold of a pre-release copy. Cynthia always got what Cynthia wanted. Her parents always made sure of that. They could more than afford to. So when Cynthia had offered Mary a chance to be one of the first kids in the country to play, Mary had jumped at the opportunity. At first, she was a bit hesitant about leaving her little brother unattended at home. It was a weekday, which meant her mother was at work, and the only one left to watch him was Mary. Mary was always taking care of her brother, having to make sure that he was fed, cleaned, and did his homework, whilst her mother was either at one of her many jobs or off gallivanting with her friends. Mary was none too fond of the company her mother kept. They were always so judgmental and critical of everything Mary did, from the clothes she wore to the way she spoke. Nothing was ever good enough for them. As far as Mary's mother and her mother's friends were concerned, Mary was a little dougla, nobody that no matter what she did in her life, she would amount into a somebody that nobody would ever concern themselves with. An opinion they took great pride in frequently reminding her. She was the outside child, the mistake. When Mary had tried to tell Cynthia that she had to watch her brother until her mother came home, and also it was a weekday, Cynthia gave her a slew of scenarios as to how popular this would make her, and if she didn't do it, how unpopular Mary would become in their class. Cynthia had told her not to be a choopity and to come right over unless she was happy becoming a nobody in class again. That last statement had struck a chord in Mary. Being a girl from humble beginnings, she had fought tirelessly at maintaining her popularity status amongst the other members of her class. Being poor was something that got one easily ostracized from the popular circle and kept Mary in a constant state of continuously having to prove her value to the group. Once Cynthia assured Mary that the game would be over long before Mary had to take the returning bus home, Mary had agreed to come over and play with them. After setting her brother in his playpen with a box juice and some Crick's crackers, she had made sure to snatch up her umbrella before heading out the door. It was that time of the year, after all. She had been barely able to contain her excitement for the 30 or so minutes that it took the bus to carry her to her desired stop. She had pretty much run the entire way, from the bus stop to Cynthia's home in Valsayn Estates, a trek that usually took her about 10 minutes if she were walking. Valsayn was a place where many of the wealthiest folks in Trinidad live, which was why she was not surprised when she had first learned that Cynthia and her family also lived here. In order for Mary's surreptitious plan to go off without a hitch, she would need to catch the 6:45 bus. This would grant her about a half an hour window to make it home before her mother did, which should have been more than enough time. Or so she had first thought. By the time Mary had arrived, many of her classmates were already there and in the middle of a game, one that lasted a lot longer than Mary would have preferred. When the losing kids stepped out, Mary and a few other latecomers took their place. The game lasted just under an hour, with Mary coming in the top 5 players, which meant that she stayed in for the next game while the losers were replaced. They played 3 more games, 2 of which Mary managed to place first in, much to the ire of Cynthia. About halfway through the 5th game, when it was more than clear that Mary would be taking home another victory, Cynthia accidentally knocked the board over and spilled the pieces everywhere. It would take them at least 10 minutes to reset the board to the exact specifications of where they were in the game. Mary checked her watch and was shocked at how late it was. She wasn't sure if she would be able to finish the game, as she would have to leave very soon. She had explained this to her classmates, who all seemed very disappointed, but understanding. All except for Cynthia and her lackeys. Cynthia told her if she had just left then, she would miss her chance to play a very special game. A game that would forever determine the popularity status of anyone in their class who played it. And as a treat for winning so many of the rounds of Savannah Green, she give Mary the chance to go first. When she inquired as to what game it was they were going to play, Cynthia had stated loud enough for the group to hear that it was the same one she told Mary about over the phone. Cynthia, seeing the confusion on Mary's face, leaned in close and whispered one word into her ear, a word that sent chills down Mary's spine. They were going to play Mum. Mary knew the kind of game this was, and it was the kind she was none too fond of. Mum, or Mr. Umbrella Man, was a game similar to the likes of Bloody Mary, King Cross, or Lady Spades, one where you test your resolve against some type of perceived supernatural entity or situation. It was a game designed to weed out the scaredy cats from their group. Cynthia had sprung her trap well. If Mary backed out now, Cynthia would claim that it was because Mary was really afraid of playing, and not because she had to go home in time. Mary was trapped. If she left now, she could kiss her hard-earned popularity goodbye. Having no other choice, Mary agreed, and they all went upstairs into Cynthia's attic to play. Cynthia also made sure that Mary brought along her umbrella. Mary didn't understand the rules of the game, so Cynthia had her lackeys explain it to her. They would stand in a circle whilst Mary stood in the middle, holding her umbrella closed. Mary would then have to repeat a nursery rhyme while the other children chanted a chorus. During the rhyme, Mary would have to open her umbrella 3 times, and on the 3rd time, she was supposed to pull the umbrella downwards so that it was almost on her face. Look up into it, and she would see the Umbrella Man. When she saw him, Mary was supposed to whisper and ask him a favor. The Umbrella Man, if he deemed her special enough, would grant her any favor she desired. Normally, Mary would have considered these kinds of games silly, but she had had the unfortunate experience of playing one of them before. It was called stiff as a board, light as a feather, and her doing it all the way to the end was one of the main reasons why Mary's popularity was as high up in the class as it currently was. Even though her experience playing that game had left her, well, scared stiff as a board for weeks after, if she played this game all the way through and didn't quit, perhaps her popularity might rise to exceed that of even Cynthia's. Probably not, but a girl could dream. And if it turned out to be true, she already knew what she was going to ask the Umbrella Man for. She was going to ask him to be rich beyond her wildest dreams. With the prospect of an unbelievable wealth soon to be hers, Mary marched herself into the room ready to change her life for the better. There was no need for her to be afraid any longer. The nice Umbrella Man was going to make her happy forever. Mary could not have been more wrong. Chapter 2. Rain, Rain, Go Away. So tell me again, Mr. Man, what is it exactly happened here? The constable asked the young boy sitting in front of him. The poor kid was on the verge of tears, but the officer was in no mood for dishing out sympathy to the lad, for he and the rest of his unit were in the middle of watching a football game when they got a call. And if it was one thing he hated more than anything else, it was having his games interrupted. Well, we were playing this game, the boy began. What game? The officer interrupted. The boy looked like he was about to reply, but his face kind of froze. In the way, his mouth was just hanging open. He looked as if he had just gotten something caught in his throat. The officer's already limited patience was quickly wearing thin. Whoa! The officer snapped at him. What game it is Alia was playing?" The boy, looking visibly confused, tried his best to recollect what had happened, but ended up answering the officer's questions with a blank face and a shrug. The officer dismissed the boy and then went over to speak with his superior. "Same as the last 3 kids I asked," he said, all hyped up like they want to tell me a story, and then the moment I asked them what happened, it's like a sequoia sucked them sinal. As his fellow officers bustled about, trying to collect witness statements and coordinate a search for the missing girl, the supervising inspector glanced at the scene around him. He glanced at the numerous children huddled about, blank expressions smeared across all of their faces. He turned toward the sound of someone shouting very angrily. It appeared as though the young girl's mother had just arrived. With a deep sigh, he resigned himself to the very unpleasant task ahead of him and walked over to speak to the child's mother. Just what in the hell happened here, he wondered. As clear as a foreshorn sunset, Mary remembered it all. As for as long as she lived, she knew she would never forget this night, never forget what happened to her. She would never forget those eyes. She had stood in the center of the room, the rest of her classmates forming a wide circle around her as the room got dark. Cynthia had said that they needed it to be dark before they could begin, much to Mary's annoyance. Then they had Mary hold the umbrella above her head and begin the rhyme. Even though Mary had only heard the rhyme for the first time only moments ago, she somehow knew every word as if it were something she had been saying since she could speak. Just before she began, she remembered her mother's friends warning her about never opening an umbrella inside. It was either something about not getting married or letting bad spirits into your house. She couldn't quite remember, nor did she care. Her mother's friends were bumsies, the whole lot of them, and soon they were never going to be her and her brother's problem ever again. Mary was ready to begin. She was ready for what she deserved. She began to chant the rhyme. "Rain, rain, go away. Come again another day. Here I stand and open the way. Please can you come out and play?" The surrounding children began chanting in unison. "Umbrella man, umbrella man, umbrella man." Mary continued. "Rain, rain, go away. I have something I wish to say. Grant me all I ask today. For any price I will gladly pay." The surrounding children continued their chant, each time getting louder and louder. "Umbrella man, umbrella man, umbrella man. Rain, rain, go away. Come again another day. The deal is done now. I'll have my fun because Mr. Umbrella is here to stay." With the rhyme completed, Mary eagerly opened her umbrella and lowered it to her face. With a hopeful smile, she opened her eyes, looked right up into it, and screamed. Thunder roared throughout the room, causing many of the frightened kids to accompany Mary's wail, though theirs possessed just a fraction of the terror that was present in Mary's. Mary immediately wet herself, for the fear that now gripped her was beyond any that her mother could ever conjure. As the terror flooded through her veins like ice water, Mary's mind shouted only one word: "Run!" And so Mary did just that. She flung her umbrella to the side and ran out of that room as fast as her little legs would take her. In a flash, she was down the stairs, through the living room, and out of Cynthia's house, as panicked feet carried her through the small woods surrounding Cynthia's home. Mary had a new fear that consumed her more than the one from upstairs. She didn't know why or how, but she knew, more than anything, that she needed to get back home. She needed to get to her little brother. Thinking back on it now, Mary wasn't sure why she had felt that way. Her brother would be fine. True, he was only 5 years old, but she had been on her own from even before she was that age, and nothing bad had ever happened to her. Well, excluding the beatings her mother gave her for either not doing her chores, her homework, or if her mother was just in one of those moods. Realizing that not only was she going to get a beating from her mother, but she'd probably be the laughing stock in school for weeks because of what had happened. Her sobbing returned at full force. That was until an odd thought wormed its way to the forefront of her mind. a thought that somehow made her shiver more intensely than the cold wind now blowing over her ever could. She had dropped her umbrella in Cynthia's room. If that were really the case, then how was it that she had almost tripped over it when she was trying to catch the bus? The sound of booming thunder lifted her up to her feet, the unexpected shock of it wiping her mind clean of what exactly it was she was trying to recall. She checked her watch again. Even though it felt like she'd been sitting there for over an hour, apparently only a few minutes had gone by. Perhaps she would be lucky enough and make it home in time after all. That is, if the rain would ever let up. Right then and there, Mary wished more than anything that she could just have her umbrella back. And just like that, something up ahead in the grass caught her attention. Mary leaned as far out of the shack as she possibly could without getting soaked, as she tried her best to focus on what the strangely familiar-looking object could have been. A strange new feeling crept over Mary as she realized just exactly what it was her eyes were showing her. It was a feeling she was having difficulty trying to describe. It was an odd mixture of mostly relief and hope, but with a dark nagging fear lurking just at the back, for the object she was now so intensely staring at was her lost umbrella. The chief inspector stood in wonder as the woman in front of him continued her tirade. The woman, who was supposed to be the missing girl's mother, seemed more concerned with strangling her child for causing her this inconvenience rather than being fearful of the child's condition. "You does meet all kinds," he thought bitterly, as he continued to feign his agreement towards her nonsensical ranting. He quickly realized that the child's mother was more concerned with venting her frustration loud enough to be the center of attention than the well-being of her child. Curtly, he cut her off by telling her that he had attained all the information he needed from her and reassured her that should any new leads arise, he would contact her immediately. He summoned one of the nearby officers and had the young constable escort her home. He could ill afford wasting any more time taking useless statements. He needed to find that girl. The chief inspector notified one of the more senior officers on site that he was to be in charge and to take care of wrapping up the rest of the witness interviews, whilst himself and a few other officers were going to comb the priority bus route to see if there was a chance that the little girl could still be there. His expectations for finding her were very low, however. If this was just a case of an upset girl having to walk all the way home, she would have been there a long time, he mused. That is, if she was lucky enough to make it all the way there. Trinidad was not the safest of places, especially for young girls. With tear-filled eyes, Mary crushed the umbrella against her chest with a fevered passion and relief as she sat under the rickety shed and thanked the spirits for her good fortune. She had gone over every inch of the umbrella at least 3 times just to be sure. It was definitely hers. She didn't know why or how it was possible, nor did she care. All that mattered was that she had gotten her umbrella back, and her mother was no longer going to beat her. Wiping just enough tears away for her to clear her vision, Mary glanced at her watch. She still had time. Spirits willing, if she started running from now, she would be able to make it home before her mother. Her sobs reformed themselves into small fits of giggling as she righted herself and dusted off her dress. The fortunate turn of circumstance was only now really starting to sink in. Everything was going to be okay. She was really going to be okay. Ducking under the galvanized roof, she glanced up at the sky. It appeared that the rain would still be heavily forthcoming for a long time to come. It didn't matter anyway. She had her umbrella. She would make it home. Mary faced the direction of her house, walked to the edge of the shed, and readied herself for the long run she was about to embark on. With a smiling face, she stuck the staff of the umbrella out into the rain, raised it so that the folded ribs were above her head, and flipped the spring open. Ice filled the recesses of her stomach as a feeling of pure dread washed over every inch of her small frame. Teeth chattering from a cold she had never once felt, Mary slowly looked up into the canopy of her umbrella and screamed like she had never screamed before. With a more than puzzled expression, the chief inspector stared at the open umbrella that lay under the roadside vending stall. Its bright pink and purple design stood out in stark contrast to the raveled and rusted structure that surrounded it. He glanced at his watch and swore under his breath. It had been 6 hours since the girl had gone missing. They were too late. The odds of still finding the young girl alive were diminishing to a scant nothing by the minute. "You sure this is hers?" the inspector asked of the officer who was standing just to the side of him. "Yes, sir," the officer replied as he flipped through the pages of his notepad. "It matches the description we got perfectly." The inspector swore again. He glanced around once more at the surrounding area, trying to see if there was anything he could have possibly missed. There were no buildings nearby, no security cameras, no billboards, no people. Just this one vending stall and an empty stretch of road, flanked on either side by miles of endless bush and trees. He scanned the road on both sides of the bus route. No tire marks from a possibly hasty stop or a hastily made getaway, if the child had possibly been kidnapped. "There is nothing here, damn it," he shouted. "Well, you know what they say, Chief," the officer next to him remarked. "Chop in the water don't leave a mark." "True that," he replied as a thought popped into his head. "But I do know a guy who can, shall we say, read ripples." The expression on the other officer's face showcased that he knew exactly who the chief was referring to, and that he was none too pleased at the prospect of having to deal with that man. Just then, one of the officers back at the parked squad car called out for him. "Inspector Anderson," the second officer shouted. "We just got a call, Looks like they found a body." "Is it ours?" the inspector shot back as he turned and hastily made his way over to the officer. "I ain't sure now, Chief, but they say they found it quite down by the foreshore." The officer replied. "The foreshore? That's quite in the fucking west," he thought. They say it have something real weird about it, too," the officer continued. "They tell me they make sure and contact you. It's your kind of thing, nah?" "Charlie," the inspector called out to the officer who was still standing by the shack and scrubbing through his notes. "Grab the umbrella and let me make a move. It's getting late, and I have a call I think I may have to make." As he heard the latter part of the inspector's statement, a groan escaped from the second officer, who was standing by the driver's door with the radio still in hand. "Nah, Chief," the officer sighed. "Tell me you ain't calling the Frenchman. I can't deal with the bullyman tonight, oui? Raymond, I really wish you'd stop calling him that. And yes, it's the Frenchman I need to call." The inspector replied as he jumped into the front passenger seat of the squad car. "Now come, bounce that starter and let me get out of here. We have a long night ahead of us." He stuck his head out of the window and called out to the other officer who had only now picked up the missing girl's umbrella from under the shack. "Charlie, move your ass now, man," he shouted. "Let we go." Charlie sprinted over to the car and hopped into the back seat. "Where are we heading, Chief?" Charlie asked. "For sure, to check out this new body they found," the inspector replied. "And then one of Alia need to find me a payphone. I have a very important call to make." The two officers groaned in unison at his mention of contacting the Frenchman. It was going to be a long night indeed. End.